then, I hope in there that are a lot of open areas.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the hopefully coldest meeting of our year. My name is Jonathan Stair, president of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society. I'm glad each one of you is here. I don't think I see any people here for the first time, but is there anybody that I overlooked? So thank you for coming. We're going to start with the reading of the minutes from last meeting. Richard's still having a little difficulty with his voice, so I'm going to be reading them for him. But our secretary, Richard Robinstein, is taking the minutes. Sorry, Richard. These are the minutes of January 4th, 2026 meeting. Jonathan Stair called the monthly meeting of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society to order at 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, January the 4th, 2026. 21 members and guests were present. He welcomed the attendees. First-time attendees were invited to introduce themselves. August 2025 program meeting minutes were not available at the time of the meeting. And that had been the last meeting for which we had a formal meeting. Treasurer Membership Secretary Margaret Berg presented the November-December 2025 Treasurer's Report showing a starting balance on November 1st, 2025 of $15,978.43, expenses totaling $376.07, and a net cash balance on November 30th, 2025 of $15,677.56. Beginning December 1st, 2025 of $15,677.56, a net cash balance on December 31st, 2025 of $15,464.24. Society currently has 136 members, 9 new, 18 life members, 4 family members, 1 life member deceased. Harold Frager. York County History Center Director of Library and Archives Nicole Smith, Vice President of Interpretation, provided information about upcoming January programs of the History Center. Many of the programs will be geared toward the 250th anniversary of the country. And then she noted this program is being recorded. Jonathan Stair made several announcements. Recognized the success of SCPGS's 50th anniversary, recognizing Margaret Berg and her crew. Secondly, thank those who helped with Moisture Fest. Not content with the numbers we got, will reevaluate attending next year. On the first Saturday in November, Jonathan, Lynn, and Margaret spoke to a group at Northeastern York County Preservation Society in North Haven. 15 people attended. Those who attended were enthusiastic, but the technology was lacking. The 2026 Palatine's to American National Conference will be held June 18-20, 2026 in Lancaster, PA, and the SCPGS will have a booth. And then the following week, the Lincoln Highway Association will have their annual meeting. Vice President Richard Kunkel gave an overview of future programs. February the 1st, 2026, Mount Pisgah Cemetery and African American Cemetery in Wrightsville. Speakers Becky Anstine and Tina Charles. March the 1st, 2026, using state administration records and genealogical research. Speaker will be Richard Kunkel. April's meeting will not be on the 1st since this is the Easter Sunday, but the meeting will be on the 12th. May 3rd, Aaron McWilliams, Pennsylvania State Archives, is speaking of research Revolutionary War soldiers. And June 14th, 2026 will be the Henry James Young Award. Vice President Richard Kunkel stated that after June, Jonathan will be scheduling future programs. Richard has, I like this, Richard, he's talking about Richard Kunkel, has been doing this for 4 years and running out of ideas. Thank you, Richard.
Meeting,
August 30th, 2026 will be the beginning of the new program cycle. The meeting adjourned at 3:20 p.m. submitted by Richard Robinstein, recording secretary, and the minutes will stand as read. Next, we'll have the treasurers and membership report by Margaret.
Okay, as of January 1st, 2026, the balance was $15,464.24. Receipts for January were membership renewal of $70, one new person for $35, publication sales of $62, research $40, and donation of $9. $216 receipts. Disbursements, mass off for the printing and mailing of publication 94, $968.02. Palatine's to America National Conference, the table space rental is $55. Disbursement total of $1,023.02, leaving the cash balance at January 31st, 2026, $14,657.22. The membership stands at 137. That's it.
Thank you. Nicole, anything from the library?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today on this cold one. Just a couple, I'd like to tell you about a couple of programs coming up before we move on with this program. Let's see. A reminder that the webinar today is being recorded and will be available on the York County History Center's YouTube channel. Couple of events, February 6th through 8th is Treasures and Trinkets. It's a jewelry and accessory fundraiser sponsored by the Friends of the York County History Center. Highly recommend that if you're into that kind of thing. February 17th is Fastnacht Day. History Center offers, the Friends of the History Center provides free Fastnachts to the community. Everyone is welcome in the morning. February 18th, our Civil War Roundtable speaker is Walter Stair, speaking about Salmon Chase and Abraham Lincoln. That'll be a Zoom meeting only, not in person. And February 21st, we have a play by local playwright Dorothy King called Miss Lydia's Church. So thank you very much, and please visit yorkhistorycenter.org for more information.
Thank you. Listen, a couple quick notes here. At our January meeting, the board voted to purchase a new rolling ladder for the History Center's archives in the amount of $857.19. In April, we need to present a ballot of officers for the coming program year, so we're seeking nominations for officers. The positions up for election or re-election will be president, vice president, director at large, and we still have a vacancy in the director of public relations. So if you're interested in one of those positions, please see me, and we'll be glad to put your name on the ballot. Also, as mentioned in minutes, probably mention this every meeting, we are having a table at the annual meeting of Palatines to America in Lancaster. That's June 18 through 20. And I'm seeking volunteers to help staff that table so that those of us who register for the program can also attend some sessions. If we get enough people, we think we'll have to be at the table maybe an hour or 2 hours for the whole time. It's Thursday evening, all day on Friday, and then Saturday up till about 3 p.m. Other volunteer opportunities include helping us to abstract or transcribe records for special publications. We have lots of ideas, and every time we look around the table, we say, who's going to do it? So I decided I'm going to ask for volunteers. If you would like to abstract or transcribe a record, we have some ideas of things that could be done. Some of it may involve going out to the York County Archives, but please see me or Erica Runkles, our publications director, if you're interested in doing that. As the minutes mentioned, I'm working on programs for next year, and Richard, just say you don't have to put each one of these down. I just want to tantalize you with some things I've already arranged. In October, Greg Huber of Eastern Barn Consultants is going to do a program on York County barns. And in November, we have the unique opportunity of having John Dietz, who is an Old Water River Brethren. You know, the Old Water River Brethren are also known as Yorkers because they started in York County. I think they're the only religious denomination that originated in York County. He's going to talk to us about the history and the beliefs and practices of the Old Water River Brethren. Next January, my daughter, at much arm twisting, is going to make a dish based upon a Revolutionary War recipe. And so she's going to come and talk about the process that she did. She doesn't like history, she doesn't like genealogy. But I said, all you need to do is tell us how you found this recipe, what things that were different about it, how was it to put it together and so forth, and then you get to taste the results of her work. So that was kind of stimulated by Richard's mincemeat pie. I said, well, if Richard can make a mincemeat pie for January, you can do something like that. So she's doing that. Next February, so a year from now, Steve Nolt from the Young Senators of Town College will be speaking to us about Pennsylvania Mennonites, the Revolutionary War. And if you haven't picked up the theme, we're going to beat the Revolutionary War theme to death over the next 8 years. Because there are many opportunities, many things to learn about. And we do hope in August to take through these doors here, there'll be an exhibit on the Revolutionary War. Any other news or business? Okay, if not, Richard's going to come tell us about the programs for the rest of this program year and introduce our speakers.
I'm Richard Conkle, Vice President of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society. We only have a couple programs left, March, April, May, and June. March, as stated before, is truly about the state papers. And I wrote a series of articles over, this was last year, that addressed most of those different state papers and genealogical information that can be found. And otherwise, just very interesting information about people's daily lives, how they live, things they ate, did, and all sorts of things. So that will be March the 1st, 4 weeks from today. Hopefully a little warmer weather, but there's no guarantees. Then the April meeting, as said before, will be April 12th. We're not meeting on Easter Sunday. That will be presented by Alicia Corey, who worked for Prospect Hill Cemetery. And she's doing a project on Revolutionary War soldiers, specifically the ones that are buried in Prospect Hill Cemetery. Then the May program is Aaron McWilliams from the Pennsylvania State Archives about Revolutionary War records that are found at Pennsylvania State Archives. And our June program is Henry James Dental Board. I don't think we officially voted. We haven't announced it yet, so why for now? Probably next month we'll announce it to the recipients of that board or something like that. So our speakers for today are one very familiar and one a bit new to us. It's Becky Anstine and Tina Charles, and they've done some research and put this program together about the historic African American cemetery in Wrightsville, which is called Mount Pisgah Cemetery, and we're going to learn a whole lot more about that here momentarily. Please give a warm welcome to those of them.
As you can see, a tombstone here that is put up in memorial of the soldiers who fought during they weren't all soldiers, they were volunteers in Wrightsville when the Confederates came. There is a story that goes around that there was one individual who was killed when the bridge was burned. They set it off, and to this day, nobody knows who that person was or where they came from. There's a lot of people who were working on that bridge were from Columbia. So Tina's gonna do that someday. She's gonna find that.
I've been trying very hard, but there are literally no record other than that. I believe the spending Brick had asked for some volunteers and assembled like a local group of men, but nobody's really sure. There's no existing list of who all those men were. So I started going through census records of all men by age around that time that would have possibly signed up, but that's a long process.
But there is one soldier who died who is not buried in Mount Pisgah. And I think he is probably the only African American who died of all the men who left and went to fight the war. As you can see, he was married to Mary Strawbridge. He enlisted in New Jersey. We have a physical description of him, and he was killed at the Battle of Petersburg, Virginia. He probably was buried in one of the mass graves because usually at that time, very few bodies were brought back to their home towns to be buried. He was survived by 4 daughters, and they had to have a guardian appointed when their husband got the pension, and then she remarried later to another man who was living in Hydesville. 51 veterans have been identified: the 12 Civil War, 2 Buffalo soldiers, 2 Spanish American, 14 men from World War I, 15 from World War II, 2 from the Korean War, 1 from Vietnam, and 3 peacetime veterans. So there's quite a military presence in that cemetery. Before there was a cemetery, there was a community. And as early as 1811, Suzanne Wright Houston had inherited a parcel of land called Westphalia from her father, John Wright, the fairy John Wright. She divided that into 99 lots. You could get a lot by paying $99 and drawing the number out of a hat. And that's how you purchased your lot. Probably there was a lot of trading going on. If somebody got 36 and you got 50 and you wanted 37, and it would individually swap properties like that. Charles Bodie bought the first lot in 1811. But he bought it on the wrong side of the road. He bought his property on the land that was inherited by Suzanne's sister, Patience. When John wrote his will, he named his 2 sons, there's 3 sons back on, told what land they were getting, and said, and to my daughters. He never gave their names, which is kind of strange that he didn't tell who his 2 daughters were that were getting this property. But eventually they showed up when they started selling the land. James Bodie, somehow or other, I think he's related to Charles, but I haven't figured out yet because there's no connection between the 2. Had a home on 2nd and Chestnut Streets where he started to hold services. He was a reverend. He lived for many years. And he shows up many times in performing marriages. He also had a son, which we'll hear about later, who went into the ministry. There were also 2 other individuals born in Wrightsville that went into the African American church ministry. One of them became a bishop down in Baltimore. The other one went to Canada, to Kent Chafford, Canada, where he set up a church there, and he died and is buried. And it's also the same area of Canada where Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and many others, John Brown was even up there in that area, and a lot of people from around Maryland, Baltimore, and even some from here migrated up there during the 1850s. The William Jones's tombstone says, born in Little York, on this cemetery in Canada. In 1848, the church decided, the Bethel AME, we have 2 different churches that were African American Methodist churches in Wrightsville. One was on Orange Street, and one was Mount Pisgah, or the Stone Church Cemetery Church on 2nd Street. The first church was built in 1830. There are some records around, but I haven't seen them, did you? And by 1852, they were recording ministers. 1853, the trustees of both of the Wesleyan Church bought the property that we call Stone Church on Second Street. By 1854, Bethel AME had moved. There was a fire at one of their churches, and eventually they settled on Orange Street and built a brick church. And at this point, it is now a residence in Wrightsville that is kind of restored. 1856, Stone Church was erected on 79 and number 8. And that's the church that we kind of assigned out Pisgah to. The earliest records were found and placed in a tombstone, in a cornerstone. And then I haven't figured out how far the cornerstone off. We're afraid the church will fall down. But in that cornerstone, it says they put deeds, church records, early histories of the church, and some other newspaper articles maybe, and coins.
I'm really excited about them.
And then by 1990, the Wrightsville board showed that there were only 9 other people living in Wrightsville. When you consider that in the 1830, 1860 time period, there were over 100. And at least 50 families living. Where did they go? They moved to Williamsport for work. Some of them moved to Olean, New York. They migrated other places for other jobs that were better paid. Kind of a list of the later years with Bertie there. Personally taking care of the cemetery and upkeep herself. She sold sandwiches, crab cakes to people to raise money so that she could afford to pay people to mow the grass. Not necessarily to take care of the tombstones, but to make sure everything was kept in order. And then the Stewarts took over. Then Warren Taylor took over. Then Larry Times and Missy Pink, they were all individuals who were volunteering their personal time to mow grass and make sure that the cemetery looked taken care of. And finally, the Wrightsville Cemetery Association stepped in. And they now maintain and make sure that the cemetery is taken care of. This is the original map that Susanna Wright had with her plots in it. You can see Price Creek is up top, Susquehanna Tidewater Canal, and then the Susquehanna River. And all this area in between is where we're talking about where the families lived.
Oh, you got a point on.
Oh,
So fresh for you again.
yeah,
On this part too. Down here's the 5 water.
and up here to right, to your left, down 90, 89. There, those lots in there are the ones with the cemetery and the church on. And many years later, in the 1940s, a woman by the name of Jenny Bear Sheep was written up in the Washington DC social column under Early's Prattles or something like that. But Jenny's husband was a lawyer, and Curly said that she liked nothing better than coming up to Sheep's shack, sitting on the porch, looking at Crites Creek and looking across at the cemetery. But a lot of the social gatherings or friends that the Sheepsman friends with would come up here. And Curly also talked about the garden that they had that grew all these vegetables. They're very fortunate. You don't have that.
So
It's not, it's to the right.
it's not on it then.
No, it's not.
Go back to that previous one. It's, yeah, where it says home.
Okay,
Right
okay.
there.
That lot of times they call it Helen Turnpike too.
First month.
Yeah. Second Street. Yeah, but this is like right before you go, right, for the second.
Gotcha.
I was playing around one day. The yellow highlights were where the cemetery and the church are. Different yellow markers show properties that were owned by different families. Up in the corner is Henry McPeak's house. And I was just trying to figure out how many people actually owned houses in that area. Because later on, Dr. Jameson was going around buying up all those properties that had been owned by other people. This is another map that shows where the Orange Street Church was, is a big circle, and then the little circle was where the Stone Church was. Yeah. Yeah, and you can see. Second Street. Yeah. So it's between Middle Alley and Mulberry Street. The Middle Alley used to be an alley going all the way back up, and now today, right here in this area is the parking lot for Catholic Church. And it sits right here, and when you turn off Second Street, you can go up into the parking lot here. But there is still like a division because there's a fence back here on the cemetery for Stone Church, and then there's a fence around here. This is about where the cemetery for the Catholic cemetery. The 1894 Burnside map. These are always pretty cool to look at because you can see the Stone Church with the little tombstones in the back. And then you can see the location of the Bethel AME Church. The interesting thing is to me that there is still a division. Orange Street stopped right where you see it on the map. And if you look at the way things are built today, there's a much newer, modern development where that Orange Street stopped. So it was never really extended for development. I'm telling you a story about it. My about that. I was trying to find the church, Bethel, and it said letter F. And I'm going crazy looking for a letter F. Oh, that's not a flagpole. That's an F. Some days. This is an overhead view. You can see Spring Alley, Orange Street, Richmond Plus, Mulberry Street in relationship to the lots that were on the original. So I'm saying that here. But the new section back here, church over here, the cemetery directly behind it does go up inside it, right on the house next to it. And then this is Middle Alley, like I said, it's huge stop. And then Second Street, that's Catholic. And I was in on the thing when I was starting to watch. We thought it was pouring out, so we better. That kind of thing. Once again, you can see it was starting to run a little bit. James Bodie, his house, he was a long time minister, one of the first ministers to start a church. I was first I was there, now meetings like this, like it's kind of like the that one church was registered in our file. 1876, up in the corner is the school. Originally, that was Union Church. And in Wrightsville, the Lutherans, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians all used that building as a starter. They would hold their meetings, sermons, church services in that building until they had enough money to build a church. They've moved out, and then the next group will move in. And before it was torn down, it has been turned into a school for the colored children in high school. And there's a white space right beside that school. And that is what is today known as Union Cemetery. You can see it's labeled as public school and then cemetery in 1923. That's the cemetery today. There is a Jameson buried in that cemetery, but we have no idea if it was a relative of Dr. Jameson's or who that child belongs to, or even if there are more burials there, because prior to the cemetery that was set up in 1874, we have no idea where the African Americans in Riceville were buried. The parking lot is where Indian Church was located. And I think
And they do have a historic marker interpreted signage going with that. Yeah, and, they did a really nice job with fencing it in and even doing nice like what we found. This is a closer up of Pisgah. Yeah, you can see the Catholic cemetery there. So this would have been a little alley coming up here. It's a grassy area, but there's fence along here separating and fence here separating the two. And under these trees is the parking lot for that.
there's the stone church as it stands today. There's that cornerstone is down in the front behind the telephone pole. I'm not sure where there's stained glass windows there.
There was originally here, there was a huge, there's definitely the same last window up there, like when the article was about the building of the church. Do state that they have some stained glass windows, which are sometimes removed and boarded up. And up top here, there is a stone. That's the kind of thing. And in front, that's a building and rebuilt in 1891. They said the limestone was taken from the quarry of Dr. Jameson. And I did have Jerry Jones come out and he wrote us up a report stating that the limestone came from the Midland Quarry, the quarry over by Midland House. He also gave me an idea where even we got that motion from for that. This is the back of it. And down here in the rear, there is a cornerstone that says 1858, made of sandstone. Which he said he believes came from building something. And that is a close up of the stone on the front at the top, which is the founding date of the AME Zion Church in New York, which I believe is 1796.
In 1874, Robert and Francis Smith sold that property to the trustees in the church. And told what lots were included. In 1933, this church cemetery was the second to Lebanon church to have the markers recorded. There are 4 other cemeteries that are African American in North County, and those gravestones were not recorded during this time period. But you can see she found 88 markers, and they would tell what was on that marker. And if you look at those maps over there, you'll notice that there are owners of plots, and sometimes there are names of who is buried in those plots, But if there's nothing, then we have no idea who's buried in that plot.
Yeah. One of the funny things, ex-wife funeral home, which today is fourth generation home. Originally had a funeral home also over in Columbia, but they're still located in Wrightsville. And they actually are on the map as owning a couple lots. And we started another project, they had graciously allowed us to go through their burial ground and be able to see who they buried in the cemetery. And we're learning all kinds of interesting things about, you know, the things that they noted. But they do have their records all the way back, and most funeral directors at the time were furniture inventors also. So on one page, it will talk about they sold a bed, a dresser or a table, and on the next page, oh, there's Mr. Jones and his receipt for everything that was used, whether it was selling. What are they calling them down? Sweeper. I mean, they had it down to every little detail, saying that they advertised in the newspapers and things like that. You were actually able to find others that were there to give us more detail about who was involved, maybe the arrangements for that family member. Oh, we do know, but unfortunately, we didn't tell us where. Okay, it's very, but that's
That's one of the interesting things also, besides Snoopers was $2 paid to lady attendant. So,
Yeah.
how many of you have seen a lady attendant at funerals?
Yeah. Or even more interesting was when a couple that said that they had, holes drilled in the bottom of the basket, and it was placed on top of bricks to allow air to circulate in case the person wasn't really best. And so they could, I guess, scream for help. They didn't have the bells they were ringing to let people know that they weren't dead, but they did ask for that. I was shocked. This is a view of the cemetery from the Mulberry Street side.
One of those maps that's over there.
We do have copies, Dwayne Raver, who actually got us all with when we was first there. Had started, handing them the reason, had started doing research on the individuals buried there, particularly the veterans, and he literally went around and tracked down at least 3 different maps that former caretakers had. And I told him to bring them in here, and the history center was and those things. So they do have them on file here digitally and accessible. Yeah.
There's 3 different types of markers that have been found. Buried on the grass, the leaves, the leaves. Yeah, you can't really find it, that's it, I found it, you know, I don't. Harvey. She was the caretaker for many years, and to put it in perspective, one of the things that she talked about was Alfred Willie Reed, who was a Civil War veteran. And she talked about him, didn't know him, and I find a picture that someone who was still alive in 1885 had known and talked to a Civil War veteran was kind of interesting. Yeah. We'll compare to the next. There's William's tombstone, the before and after. She told a story about him that he would tell stories. He was a little man, smoked a pipe, and had a cane. He was very pleasant, and he wore a wide rim Civil War hat. So when we had an open house type thing, is there a storyboard? One of the people who came up and looked at that storyboard said, I just bought her house. So she's been trying to find information on the house, and somebody else in the group said, oh, Aunt Lily always used to hand out licorice
Yeah,
to all the kids and
yeah, we've had multiple people from Wrightsville older, they came to her and said, oh, I remember her licorice. She was known for handing out licorice. The Boy Scouts who had ultimately took over the church in the 30s, they were there for the last 40 years. They had Boy Scouts in there. And they said when we would come out from a meeting, there's 30 of us sitting out there on the porch with a bowl of licorice. And everybody remembered that. And the young lady who recently bought her house, when she did research on the house, and that she said she noticed everything was really short and small. And so she was trying to do some renovations, and then she said she found out at one point that over 8 people at one time lived in the house together, and she said, I could just never imagine because it's a small house. And, but she said she's gonna start getting decorations and then out.
a lot of the soldiers were discharged in Texas and I think William Reed was one, and just out of curiosity, I wanted to see how long it would take to go from where they were discharged to get back to Wrightsville. When I first started, I was on a comment, some of this. And I said something to Dennis Brandt about, well, how did they get from Texas back to Wrightsville? Dennis just looked at me and said, they walked. Yeah, so you can see just how long it would take. He went by plane, by car. And drove it.
How long?
And that, I tried to get Google to calculate how long it would take, and it could not come up. It's
walking.
Can you read it? It's hard to see.
29 hours, but every mile of driving for flight. Unfortunately, 7 hours, 55 minutes for flying.
And what about walking?
You could do
That's
10
what
miles,
Google could tell me.
Oh, Google couldn't tell you.
you could do 10 miles in a day if you're slow. An army could do 15 miles in a day, so you can calculate it.
The shot, they're probably good. The shot in the knee.
They could have carried them.
Well, yeah.
Didn't some of them take a ship?
Maybe a train.
Maybe if they were influenced. Yeah, that's what I did.
Okay.
They would go to the Philadelphia hospital.
Right, right.
You have to have money to get on the train. And they were still waiting for their pay. So it's just kind of something interesting to think about. This is another couple that had gone and taken over Leon's story. As they and then was buried in the cemetery. Ruben Simpson, you'll find his name on a lot of documents. He was guardian for some children, but he was also a barber. He run ads in the paper. And it just struck me about the ad that he ran about his room being on ACD. A lot of clever advertisements. Henry McPeak, I had pointed out earlier about this house. He was putting it up for sale because I think that's about the time that the family members all started moving to New York. The tombstones for Henry and his wife Mary. Information about Henry buying his property. Son Rowan, everybody kept coming back to Wrightsville, where it's got to be there.
We have a lot of families from Columbia that are actually buried in Wrightsville. And in speaking with some folks from Columbia in our little group, they basically stated that in Columbia, there was no designated burial ground for African Americans, other than Potter's Field. And so a lot of them, you know, why wouldn't they come right across the river if they can purchase a lot buried in one dignified way?
And if they had family buried there, the community members were a big part of this. Charles Bodie and then James Bodie. Reverend James Bodie had a son who became a minister. But he graduated from Lincoln, was one of the few to go to Princeton Theological Seminary in Albany, New York. got assigned to a church up there and decided, I think I need some more. So he went back to school in New York and became a doctor. At the same time, he was a minister. He was also running his doctor's practice. So we kind of laugh a little bit because no matter what stage you were in life, Reverend Betty was there to take care of you from the beginning to the end. Eventually, he wound up out in Arkansas and then up to Indianapolis, Minnesota, where the Goodrich family had all landed many years ago. He had to resign from the ministry and he went off because he became deaf, but that didn't stop him. He went on to do an intense, very deep history from 1619 when negroes first came to this country, studying ethnology, writing all kinds of articles for the newspapers about anything and everything. So this lack of being able to hear did not stop him. At one point, I found he had written a letter to maybe the Wrightsville Borough Council about education for the students. He did come back to York to settle his father's estate and to sell property that was left to his brothers and sisters. So he kept in close contact with his family in York. But he had quite an unusual life. Dr. Jameson was another individual that is descended from the Comstock Indians. He attended Lincoln University and Jefferson College. He married Francine Baldwin, and the Baldwin family is one of the more well-known families in Philadelphia for Underground Railroad. He was the largest individual property holder in 1910. Practiced medicine for 49 years, was very active. Part of a group that brought things that they had found that were related to the Indians who lived in the area. And later that all was donated to start Indian Steps. He had 4 children. 2 sons went into the medical profession and they lived in Delaware. 1 son roamed around the countryside. And that son and his only daughter are buried in Indian Mission Cemetery in Sussex County, Delaware. And there's a story to how that happened.
And Dr. Jameson, as far as the property aside from owning a park, I came across an article from Philadelphia, basically talking about if you wanted to take the scenic route, you got to our county on Wrightsville. They said you take the boat up so far and get off here, and then you can walk along this trail graciously. You permitted to walk through the tobacco fields, also owned by Dr. Jameson. And I said, oh, now you own tobacco field, then you own the quarry, then you own property, then you own a physician.
And he died without a will.
Yes.
He and his wife both died without wills. And some of the property had been sold by his children to one of the brothers who was living in Delaware, and he died without a will, and they had to come back to Wrightsville to settle the property of that estate.
And they are 2 individuals that do not have headstones in the cemetery. Although they said to be very rare according to that certificate, so they do not have headstones.
These are some of the major families that we've talked about, that we found information on and tune in. The files here at the library can hold all kinds of things in the family files. I was looking in the Bear family file and came across a stack about this big of surveys that were sent out to every bear in York County. Spelled whatever way, all the listings would spell something at the top. Buried in that file was this statement from Henry Bear. And it gave the history of his family, their background, where they moved, where they lived, and all this was in there. How many children they had. But it was interesting that I was able to find so much information. Everything else on something. Let's see. Please stand. There it is. That's a picture of Henry there and his wife. And it was given to the History Center by a relative of theirs who was living in New York. So you can see how far things go and they come back. And people elected him like if I get 1896. Yeah. So Mr. Bear was known as a Ella position in Pisgah. It was a huge write up. And he was actually taken to court because a young lady had come from across the river to him seeking services to abort the child. And he refused them. He said, I don't do that. And so she went somewhere else and ultimately had the procedure done, but things went wrong. And so she, when questioned, lied and said that he had performed us. And she had given a statement that said that she was alone when she came to see him. He, took her in his parlor and closed the doors. And what ultimately got him off the hook was his housekeeper, who testified and said that is an absolute lie because those parlor doors, which were most likely the pocket doors that you would slide shut, she said they haven't locked in you. You can't close those. So he was absolutely never alone with her. And her sworn testimony is how he was found not guilty. But that interested you because I was like, oh wow, who's not? Martin family started down in Fox Township by 1860. They in Franksville. The boys all were on the Tiger River Canal. 4 sons and their families are buried in Mount Pisgah. 5 of their sons served in the Civil War, and 2 daughters buried Civil War veterans. And the 1 daughter and her family moved to Williamsport. And you can see who they married. James got amazed because he had to fight continuously just to get pension. These was charged in Robbins. There's Jacob's tombstones. Information on Jacob. You have 5 pension for him. Thomas Edwin Harden. He enlisted. He married Dr. Jameson's sister. He started communitism. But the interesting thing is that in his pension, he named every single man that he had worked with on the canal boats after the war. So there would be a big list. William Albert couldn't decide what his name was. He enlisted under Joseph Wilson, said that was his real name. But everybody around him said, you never heard of Joseph Wilson, and we always knew it was William Albert Hardy. And the reason he got caught up was one of his neighbors reporting him as having declaring and getting attention with false information. And after they went through and got this all straightened out, found what his name was, he did get attention. That's okay. You want to talk about him? Oh, John E. Downs stated that John had been a slave and that William helped him escape in a boat across the river. So we have somewhat definite proof that they were involved with helping.
And of the 5 Barton boys, 1 is buried in Lower Canford Cemetery. And we do have a picture of him over here, George Zach Barton. He ultimately married a young lady, married a young white lady, and that was a funny story. I read, like I said, the opera and his pension record because they can't, and then previously married, and then he took off to Philadelphia, and then when after the war he came back and met Belle, and they ultimately got married and had children, and then when he died, she applied for his pension, and then he dove into all of this and said that he was previously married, but she died before, and they couldn't find the preacher, so he married them, and she actually interestingly made a statement to her sister-in-law and said, the only reason why they're not giving me his pension is because I'm not, because she was last man. And it was very interesting, but she, after he died, actually stayed down in that area in Southern North County, and she was a washerwoman, and the one was that village down there, a lot to work in for shelter, and lived in New York City, and then
The family was from Wrightsville, and when she married Sex Barton as a second sex, and they disowned it. And somewhere along the line, people thought that her name was Nick Sherry. They couldn't figure out who she was. Well, in the pension, she named her sisters by their married names, and we start to back and trace the sisters. I found out who she was and who her parents were.
and her family is actually buried in the cemetery behind New York County Prison.
This John Downs is tombstone. John Calvin was Dr. Jameson's brother, son. Anybody keeps using the same name, so it's not hard to get confused.
It's those repeating names that they would, so this one was as well.
Who was the oldest veteran living in Whitesville? Some sources say he's into the service not as a formal enlistee at the age of 15, and then when he got old enough, he formally enlisted. But he lived in the Westlands before the war. A lot of people, some of you, Wrightsville came from those Welsh mountains. He was also at Lincoln's funeral. As you can see, he was led many parades every Memorial Day. One husband. We have a story about her, which one we go back and put that on, it was Michael Parker. And then. But Mary, Michael Parker, you also know, I used to have texting about him standing him. Some of those are still waiting to be proved if she was actually married to them. As you'll get different in the affidavits, lots of times in the pensions, you get all kinds of stories and oh yeah, she wasn't married to him, she was married to him before she married him.
And they do actively do these across America at Pisgah. And place flags for you more than. And those are some photos of their activity. There's Mr. Rayburn that we were talking about, but pretty much that's something you got everything. He's my God, his daughter served with the American Legion and right now, and someone told me he was just so passionate about what was going on that it just made them want to be involved. And Wrightsville, I would say, is a very beautiful community with a lot of involvement. All of the, everybody knows everybody. And when we had open house in the church, first time we got to go in the church, I was so excited. But when we got to go in, just having, residents come in and just tell stories. We really need to start doing some sort of oral histories because they all have stories to tell of people that are buried there. They knew them, they grew up with them, they worked with them, they saw them. But Dwayne, it was so interesting because when we were cleaning up the church for the open house, that hat was hanging on one of the bulletin boards there. And so we took it down. The Boy Scout master said, no, it's on his hat. And I mean, it just struck us because he had just recently passed before we got to do that. And it's like he found a way to be there. So we proudly displayed his hat right where it was, because he was just so passionate. And that was a statement that he had made about the SCP, and that was one of the reasons why it was so important to him. And he would do little tours with the Cub Scouts and, you know, have them there team and, you know, youth groups. He was just so passionate about it.
This was Lynn's contribution. She said,
It wasn't mine, I nudged you.
yeah, you suggested, yeah. You'd ask me something that would make me wanna come to see this. Okay, so these are the questions that we came up with, and we didn't have the answers to them.
So one of the more significant finds, which was thanks to Dwayne, because in his notice of, you know, there's only one female veteran there. But her stone doesn't say she's a veteran, but she has applied there. He said, World War II. And this was right around the time the 6 AAA movie came out. And so I said, well, you know, let me look her up and see what I can find. And I called him back so excited. I said, wait, she was a 6 AAA member. And he was like, oh, yeah, my wife was telling me that there's a movie or something. I said, yeah, it's like really significant. But the reason why we missed her was because Anna Bidey, she originally was from Ohio, and she lived in Ohio at the time that she enlisted. Her mother and father at the time had just recently gotten divorced, and her father moved here to New York and remarried, and her mother stayed and remarried in Ohio. So she enlisted, she served overseas with the 6 AAA, and when she was discharged, she went back over to France and then ultimately to England to study tailoring at some tailoring schools over there, and came back over with the idea that she was going to open her own shop and or school to teach tailoring. She went back to Ohio to try to do this, and I don't think she had much luck because she was in the newspaper there. They had a program called Jobs for Veterans. And she was featured on that show and was hired by a local dressmaker there, but I don't think it was, because I'm gonna say within a year or two, she moved here to New York, and her father owned a couple of properties here, so she did ultimately open her tailoring shop, and her ad was constantly in the newspaper. And she was very passionate about teaching. She taught a course on that at Pisgah when it first started. And back when York County VOTEC started, she had written a scathing letter editorial in the newspaper to say that she had gone to them and said, why aren't you teaching this very vital trade right now? So many people could get jobs sewing. And, you know, so they finally did start that course, and then she applied to be the instructor, and we told her she didn't have enough experience. The superintendent of the school said that we knew someone else who could do it, and because his grandmother had taught him how to sew. So, you know, there was just this whole, like, on my page of her just basically saying, but she had very involved in her community, had prize in school board and things like that. And even when she was elderly, she participated in Olympics and won a gold medal for backstroke and front stroke at an advanced stage. And she also owned a prize cast that she, did shows with that she was well known for. But she married, Mr. Grayson. And we do have information on the Grayson family over here, because her mother-in-law actually in York, over around where York High was, she owned a property which was sort of like a hotel or boarding house, but it was listed in the city books. And her mother-in-law was a fierce person too. You could go like and not her by herself, but she is buried there with her husband, who also served in World War II, and the rest of his family.
Her husband was also an educator in Lime City School District.
Yes, he was the principal of the small business for a while when we go back.
Dr. Jameson's daughter Renee. As you can see, she is dressed in Indian regalia. When she was in, I would say, her early 20s, she and Jenny Bear, and then another woman from Columbia, all went down to Lewis, Delaware, to teach in the schools down there. Winona, using her Indian background, got herself at the Manitoba Heritage Center and started what is now known as the powwows that are held usually in September now in outside of Lewis. So she was very active in that society. She had one child. The child died soon after birth, and the child was buried in Mount Pisgah. But she went back to Delaware with her husband. Her brother James was also buried down there in that cemetery. He had kind of gone around the country. He was a teacher and he taught all over the place. And possibly when his health became bad, he might have moved in with Winona. Her husband Oscar, that's Oscar on the right, but all three of them were buried in this cemetery. If you go down Route 5, which runs parallel to Route 1, outside of Lewis, Delaware, the cemetery is on Route 5, and I would drive past it frequently, never knowing that somebody from York was buried in that cemetery. This is the other woman who went down, also married in state. He was from Marietta. I'm wondering too, if when they went down there, they weren't recruited by George Henry Reed, who had been a principal in the city at Smallwood School and had gone down to Lewis to open up and teach and run the high school. There are so many connections between where people go and who they run into and why they go, but you have to probably sometimes try to keep up with them. Here's my favorite. This is my favorite. I started searching because so many people from Pisgah and Wrightsville were from Columbia. So I started searching like this for newspapers. And I came across Aunt Lizzie. Aunt Lizzie was amazing. Her real name was Annie Elizabeth Brooks. And she was actually, her family was born in Baltimore County, Maryland. And her mom had been raised by a Quaker family. And her mom died around 1908 at the age reportedly of 111. And Aunt Lizzie was one of like 10 children that they had, and they moved up to Wrightsville. And there's a story about her brother. Her brother was now 12 years old. He was one that had been kidnapped by enslavers. As you know, they would just sometimes go and snatch people, even though they were free. Their family, no one in their family had ever been so many enslaved. They were a free love family, and he was actually saved by a man from Brooke County, and so that kind of prompted them to move here. And they ended up in Wrightsville, and she said she remembered, as long as she could remember, that after that incident, they always had guns hanging on the wall in their home, and so she became a very good shot. with a rifle. And, before the Civil War, when before the Confederates came, she left, right, so she got married and had a young child, but it was right before the Civil War, around the Civil War, and so she and her child left and went to Philadelphia to wait out the war. She didn't want to be around here, probably traumatized by what had happened to her brother, and just didn't want to take that chance. So after the war was over, she came back to York County and, she worked for a few families. She was known to be a very good cook. And so she ended up working for a major Egan on West Point. And he had gotten assigned to, Camp Kansas, I think, in 1871, Fort Riley. And she was there, so she went along, she followed him there. And they moved around over 4 years. They were in Oklahoma, and Laramie, Wyoming, and she got to see General Custer in 1876. The last time he was pretty much seen before Custer's incident. And then after all of that, she got married again and ended up becoming a dairy farmer with her husband. They settled in what's known as Harmony. It's in McHenry County in Illinois, and they were there for 21 years, farming, dairy farming. But interestingly enough, that happened to be a spot where they did an annual reunion for the Civil War. And so she would go to these meetings and listen and, talk to some of the people. And once they realized how much knowledge she had from her experiences, they asked her to start speaking in engagements. So she would have someone write a speech out for her. She became what she called a speechifier. And so she was asked to do these speeches, and she would memorize them word for word because she wanted to sound, professional, and she got up there and talked. But people just loved her to death. But ultimately, she ended up, once her husband passed, she moved back there to Wrightsville. That was her home. And by the time they got up to her, they were asking her, how old are you? And she said, oh, somewhere between 16 and 116. She couldn't really guess for sure. But that is my favorite girl right there. And she just had so many interesting stories about Custer, being out in the Wild West and at the forts and having shooting contests and being given awards for her marksmanship that they could not believe that she had. This is Jenny Sheep. She was on the property along the Pikes Creek and across from the cemetery. After she stopped teaching in Delaware, she went to Howard University. And while at Howard, she met a widower from Pass Christian, Mississippi, by the name of Ambrose Sheep. His wife had died, and eventually she and Ambrose got married, and she raised his 3 boys. But they came back and forth to Wrightsville lots of times. Eventually, they did sell their house up here in Wrightsville and bought property along the Chesapeake Bay in a closed community that had been developed by Frederick Douglass's son, so that his father had a home on the bay to live in. And the house that they bought and built in that highland community was listed on the historical register list. That's, I believe, the whole community and feel with it's not ever considered. There's multiple African Americans favorite communities, including that one. Yeah, that one may have been listed. I was trying to remember. I think it might be one of the oldest ones. I don't think it's one of the before. Right, that was one of the oldest ones. But that's definitely a focus to get them. That's a huge. And there's a picture of her husband and Ambrose. They were awarded for buying the most war bonds in 1 year. They were active. They often returned here. And they both worked for the government. Yeah. I'm not sure if he was qualified or certified to argue against the Supreme Court or not. I think he did kind of. Yeah, one thing he said, very well respected family in Washington DC. Oh, yeah, they were always in pro battle, which was like the gossip. And, African American newspapers in DC were constantly talking about what the Chiefs were doing. And it was interesting because they said that their shack, at Highland, it was a joke to name it a shack, because it was by far not a shack. And everybody and anybody would be gathered there, mainly talking about the food that was served, but also, playing card games and just enjoying themselves. And then they considered Wrightsville their summer home that they would come to, and sometimes she referred to it as She's Rest. Because she said it was a place where she could come and just, get some rest that not have to deal with anything. And she talked about it a lot in the newspaper a lot, where they would say, oh, the Chiefs, she's retiring back to their summer home in Wrightsville. This is one that I'm working on. It's a St. Ledger Carter who lived in Virginia when he wrote his will. He included the Terry family and left each of those children $1,000. They were not to be going to Liberia. He wanted them to go to Philadelphia, which they did. And when they got to Philadelphia, there were guardians for each of the 3 boys and 1 daughter that were named in that will, and they had accounts there of the education and everything. But eventually, the Terry family wound up in Reading, where they worked the Underground Railroad, where they were still established one of the first schools there. There. All family was illiterate, and one of them said that the owner would get them up every morning in Virginia and teach them reading and writing, even though it was against the law. The boys were part of the Civil War. But the interesting thing is, one of those Terry girls married a Nelson. The Nelsons eventually came to York County, and the Nelson family is buried in Mount Pisgah. So you have a small chain of history that they're able to follow that, but every one of them went on to do something for education, for civil rights. And Johnson Ferry became the brother-in-law of the president of Liberia. I don't like to thought about that. So much in still working on that. There's our list of people. The oldest people buried in the cemetery. And then we live out in the Lebanon. And we only have one person off that list who lives here, Miss Anna Reed, because she was recently buried last year at Pisgah. But she was, I believe, 106. Yes, she was 106. And she actually lived over in Columbia, but she was buried in Pisgah. And those basically copies of these points that are over here for some of the families that we started when we did the open house. There is a young lady who is a member, I'm also a member of the African American Historical Society of South Central Pennsylvania, and Maxine found out that she had family, doing her family history, that she had family buried in Pisgah. So she works at Howard, and she got with a professor at Howard. He basically helped her and create a website, which she is adding information on all the people, trying to track down and sending, so give a place for people who do have family buried there to be able to come and add photos, add stories, and also maybe get some information on an ancestor that might be buried there. And she calls it the Mount Pisgah Project. So it's probably because people go not that good is one they did that.
What's the origin of the name Pisgah?
Biblical, yeah. And not to mention, I was amazed to know that up there on top of the hill, that is known as Mount Pisgah, or something, or Right, what's the church on that?
Yeah.
Burned down.
No, it's this home.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Are any of the homes on the original lots original? And are there any families that have owned the same home all the way through?
Not that we found. No, and as far as original, I don't know, we have to do a lot to see. We've got a list of the properties and who they were sold to, and I'm working on that to see if we can actually find one of those houses. Yeah, besides, Alberta's, we are doing, putting together a tour to be extended for, Riverfest. To be able to, go over there, see both the churches and then the neighborhood and there, a few of the houses of the people within walking distance for them to keep their schools. And tell some stuff, and then you just go look inside the church. But the church was abandoned by the congregation by the Antifa, and it was purchased by a Church of God in Christ, which then, Pentecostal, and then they changed their name, and they were in there for a little bit until they got their own building, but they still own the church building. And like I said, they had Boy Scouts in there over the last 40 years who just recently evacuated it, and now they're working, they're hoping to get a grant from the National Trust to help preserve, because the Boy Scouts did some things like install the system. The original lighting fixture is still hanging in the top, but they had put a drop ceiling in to preserve heat. And when you walk in the front doors, there's a balcony overhead where the choir used to sit. And so you can go up, they put drywall up to block that off from looking down into the church. So those are all reversible things that they'll hopefully be able to do. And, open it up and do a music like community purposes and next time. She was calling out there, I am.
Yeah, I have. I wanted to go, not to mention the Boy Scout that showed up at the open house and told us, did you find the bodies buried down in the basement? And I said, no. And he said, yeah, we found when we were working, when you go down, they cemented the basement, but half of it. But the other half is like a big giant dirt wall. And it's got maybe this much space between the bottom, underneath the floor and the top of the dirt. And you look back in there, and I was back there with my flashlight, and he said, yeah, we saw a back. And I said, are you sure it wasn't Hoffman that you saw? And he was like, oh, yeah, they're in there. But then talking to other, community members, they're like, was it so-and-so that said that to you? And I said, yes, they're like, don't pay him any comment. He doesn't know, there's no body buried under there. I said, okay, I still want that in the basement. Yeah, there's I could create a very creepy. There's a handprint down there in the cement that's very creepy. It's not like imprinted in the cement, it's almost like it's very creepy. I was like, I could work with that and do something and create a story for that, so.
It's not so like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and we did just have ground penetrating radar done, by Kutztown University. They came and did that to try to help us see if we could identify people that we didn't know might have been there. They want to put a flagpole in at the one edge, and I was just like, it's a little too close for comfort, to some, there's like no headstone there, but repeatedly someone comes and puts flowers, like at a spot right behind the original big monument there, look dedicated to the unnamed soldier. And I was like, yeah, I don't know if there's someone there, so let's just pause before we do that and think about that. Yeah.
That church you said about staying there. And you may understand that,
No description of it either, so.
I end up to do that.
No such thing. Yeah, it's somewhere in there, but they do have, and there's a very, very large student building beside of them, about as old as the church, but, there were original like steps beside the church going up the side into that little side area where you can tell there's maybe like 2 or 3 headstones in that area. And then most of the old Civil War soldiers and everything, but the new ones, and they are still actively there. They just got into last year, had a license, so. Let's see, this is the only way, let's see, yes, they were like, you said that she was a guy, no, but then there's they have a policy. It's not the same one. I think they got, yeah, true. I'll put it so we can kids and here. I think. Right. Susan and Mike might have been his sister and John might have had a family. We used to have a family tree. It's only he's bigger than the house, but. Yeah, I had done a whole family thing and. Rights, now, and the rights and rights, are invited and. Cause I did the early evaluation of the property, so I have all that research, so. And they found the my son, that did die, because they knew what happened to him. But John White, Barry, because they use the same names and I'm like, I just got to write it down today, I can even look at it, and then you're talking. But that's not it says, yeah, the interesting thing was that John Wright, who was the son of John Wright, also had 2 slaves. So those slaves went to the Ewing family. And once again, imagine on that mysterious book that has been lost, where they had to go register the slaves in York County. In the accounts, he registered that he had gone and registered these 2 women with some others in that registered book of York, because he paid himself to do that. But as Richard said, I mean, that book disappeared and vanished. Lancaster still has it because it's online. Yeah.
I think that's good.
Yeah. A lot of information. Well, there's notebooks up there, one is on the burials. Yeah. Civil War veterans and just deeds that have been put together to show, yeah, we have the proof that they're buried there. But we can't find any tombstones.
Okay, our meeting's adjourned, but I'm Filipina and Becky, if there's any questions personally, you want to talk to them? You take a look at these books, there's an amazing amount of work on it.
Yeah. Well, we did stuff and that's all this new game so much for one of the season when we do presentations. So she's in the car. She learned enough. Yes. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
No, you're